Welcome back to Tuesday Night Bible Study. Tonight we're going to pick back up in Daniel chapter 3. Tonight's lesson title, of course, will be Daniel chapter 3, part 2. First part of the chapter, we talked about the three Hebrews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and how a decree come out for anyone that heard any type of musical instrument was to bow down and worship this image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So I'm not going to do a whole lot of review on it, but we'll talk about it up to this point. So getting up to this point, the three Hebrews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, had actually refused to bow down and worship this image. So we're getting ready to start back at verse 13. So that's where we're getting ready to go. So Nebuchadnezzar is going to call for these individuals to come in before him, and he's going to question them. So let's get started here. Verse 13, chapter 3, verse 13. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in his rage and fury, commanded to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that they would be brought before the king. Now, think about this. These individuals were high ranked, and through, of course, God's blessings, Daniel got him a position. Usually when someone would, probably state, king, these men are refusing to follow your orders, this, that, and the other, the king would have just said, you know what, go ahead and throw them in the fire, kill them, then I'm going to kill their families, and then I'll burn their homes. But the king actually wanted to bring these men before him and question himself. He wanted to see why they refused to bow to him. And part of me wants to believe that it's because the king knew how these three men lived. The king knew these three men served the one and only true God, the Hebrew God. And I think the king was very inquisitive as wanting to know why. So let's move on. All right. Let's go ahead and read verses 14. Nebuchadnezzar spoke and said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Do you not serve my gods, nor worship the golden image which I have set up?" Verse 15. Now he says, "If it be ready that you should hear the sound of the instruments," he said, "fall down and worship the image that I made." He says, "But if you don't, this is what's going to happen." Now, I'm getting up to verse 16, and this is where I left off, and this is where we're going to start. So we see the back part now of the story here. We know that the king has brought him in, and he's questioned him, and he's asked him why. And he told him, he said, this is a decree that I made, and you are to do this. Now, let's go on. Verse 16. Let's read 16 through 18, and we'll talk about them, okay? Verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer in this matter." So, in other words, they were confident in their God, and they didn't care to let the king know this. Now, the king knows that these men will probably put their lives on the line for their God, because he's getting ready to make a statement right here in just a minute. And this statement he's making, I believe in my heart that he's challenging their God, their Hebrew God, in other words. Listen to this now. He said right here, remember, they said, "We are not careful to answer you in this matter." Check this out, verse 17. This is so good. He says, "If it be so, our God," in other words, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego says, if it be so, if it's God's will, in other words, he says, "Our God, whom we serve, will be able to deliver us." And he says, if not, he said here, in other words, what they were saying here, if he doesn't deliver us, then we're still going to serve him, king. Remember, if you go back to the end of verse 15, what I said just a minute ago about the king challenging their God. Let's go back and look at this last verse he said right here. in the very end of verse 15, he says, "And who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands?" Remember, I closed with that last Tuesday night, and I said we would revisit that verse. And right now I'm revisiting, and we will we'll revisit again before the end of the chapter here. But in other words, he's challenging. I really believe that Nebuchadnezzar was challenging the Hebrew God here. And they let him know, you know what? If he chooses to deliver us, he'll deliver us. If he doesn't deliver us, then we'll die and we'll go on to be with him. That's pretty much what the Hebrew boys was saying right here. He says right here, verse 18, "But if not, be it known to thee, king." In other words, like I said, if he chooses not to save us here, he says, "Be it known that we will not serve your gods, nor worship the golden image that you have set up." Guys, this makes a statement, a true statement for us as Christians today. And we really need to think about this statement that was made right here. No matter if it goes against our beliefs in our Lord, we should not do it, no matter what. I mean, we cannot go against our God and be a Christian. We have to live by our statutes, what God's made for us. This Bible is a roadmap, and we're to follow it. And these three Hebrews right here, they were standing up for their God. They in no way. And remember, they're standing in front of the most powerful man in the world right now. At this point in time, Nebuchadnezzar was it. He was the most powerful. Now you got to remember here, it's not just these three Hebrews that's putting their lives on the line. The king, if you go back to before, when he had his dreams, he told all the wise men, he said, "If you don't tell me this dream," he said, "I'll kill you. I'll kill your whole family." And he said, in other words, I'll destroy your home and all your items, treasures, whatever you want. So these three Hebrews right here were not only putting their life on the line, folks, but they were also putting their families and their property and all their possessions on the line. But did it matter to them? Absolutely not, because, see, we know the end of the story. It's easy for us to overlook some of these points. But think about it and put your shoes on these men's feet a minute. These men are going to be tortured, thrown in a fire furnace to burn, and could you imagine the pain and everything that would come from this? This had to be going through their minds. They had to think about this. But they drew a line in the sand. They said, "No, king, we're not going to worship your gods. We're not going to worship your golden image." So the king, and again, the king didn't have to bring him before him, but I believe two things here I believe had to happen. One thing, he was curious on these individuals, because the Bible says we'll know a Christian by the fruits they bear. We will know someone if they're living for the Lord or not, because it's not a Sunday morning, an hour, and a Wednesday night, an hour thing. We are to have a personal relationship with the Lord. So like I said before, if me and my wife only communed 1 hour or 2 hours a week, we wouldn't have a relationship. You have to have that personal relationship with the Lord. So we see here that they just refused, and they knew the punishment. They knew what was coming, but yet they stood up for their beliefs and their Lord. Now let's move on. Verse 19. Then was Nebuchadnezzar full of fury, and the form of his visage was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. In other words, it's changed. They're his enemies. He hates them. Does that make sense? Before they were rulers under him, now they're his enemies. Now, remember, let's look back just again on this. These guys had no need to defend themselves. In other words, they were not guilty in any type of matter, and they knew what they stood for. Also, they told him, we're not going to bow to your image. We're not going to serve you gods. He says, our God is able to deliver us from it. He has that power. But if he doesn't deliver us from it, then we're still going to serve him. Sometimes, as Christians, we need to think about that. When we're praying for a need, when we're praying for something, sometimes God answers prayers, but it's not at our beck and call. God will answer them prayers on his time. And sometimes that's how we need to have that attitude. We need to be able to sit back and say, Lord, I trust you. If you deliver me from this, then, Lord, I know you're able to. But if you don't deliver me, I still love you the same, and my feelings towards you is still not changed. Sometimes I think that's how we should look at it. In other words, they did not doubt God's ability. Think about this. But neither did they presume to know God's will. That's so important. Think about that again. I'll say it again. They did not doubt God's ability, but neither did they presume to know God's will. In other words, they knew God was able to deliver them, but no problem. But they had no idea what his will was going to be here. Sometimes we could take a lesson, we could learn a lesson from this right here as Christians. Sometimes we think, Lord needs to move on my time. I need this answered, or why is this happening? Lord, give me an answer. Sometimes the Lord is not going to move to that answer right then. Again, like I said, he wants us to believe on him with faith. And he will move when it's right. You know why? Because we don't know the outcome. God knows the outcome. Think about that. In other words, these guys said, let it be known, King, we're not going to serve it. We're not going to bow. We're not going to serve you gods. So these men drew a line in the sand, and they were standing firm on that line they drew. All right, let's move on. Now, remember, his visage, in other words, he went from these guys being friends, now they're foes. He says, against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, he says, therefore he spake, and he commanded that the heat of the furnace be 7 times more than it would have been heated. In other words, he had it heated up 7 times hotter than normal. And remember, this was probably a furnace they used to make bricks in. It was a brick oven, or it could have been many things. It could have been a brick oven. It could have been for their iron and steel works. We don't know, but it was a type of an oven that they would use. Somebody, like I said last Tuesday night when I said, somebody mentioned a coke oven that we used to have in these areas. That's a good example of what this type of oven would have been if you're old enough to remember back about a coke oven. But anyway, he commanded that this be heated up 7 times more than it usually was. All right. He says, in other words, he commanded the most mighty men that were in his army to bind. Now, I really want you to pay attention here. There's something really good here God pointed out to me when I taught this in Sunday school about a month ago. He commanded the most mighty men that were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. So he's given the order. Now, he's going to tie these men with ropes. Now, we're going to see a little bit more than that. They're also going to have all kinds of clothes on here. And it was customary, and I'll talk about that here in a minute. But where I want to go is these men were going to be tied. They were going to be bound. More than likely, their hands were either put in front and they were bound with their feet to where neither they could get up and move, or their hands were put behind them and they were still bound to their feet. So they were tied to where they could not get up. Does that make sense? All right. So keep that in mind. They were bound with ropes so they could not get up and move or try to get out of the fire. In other words, their first instinct when that heat hit them was to try to get out of it. They were bound so they could not run. In other words, they couldn't move more than likely. All right? That's very important to remember. Now, he picks 3 of the most mighty men in his army, the strongest, probably the biggest Arnold Schwarzenegger looking guy there was, 3 of them. These guys were going to carry him up and drop him into this fire. So they would have had to have went up above the fire and dropped them down into the fire, okay? Now, let's move on. These men were bound in their coats. In other words, they had their coats on, their hosen, their hats, and other garments. Now, let's talk about that a little bit. All this would have been a Babylonian attire. They would have had hosen on. They would have had a dress type of a coat, probably different colors. We don't know the colors. They also would have had a silk dress type coat on underneath it. They would have had a turban on their head. That's hat means turban here, okay? So he bound them in their attire. In other words, whatever they was probably serving in there, he bound them in that, and he was going to throw them in. Remember, this king was going to make an example of these 3. They refused his orders, and he was going to kill them. Once he destroyed them, he would have moved to their families, and then he would have moved to their homes and their valuables. And he would have destroyed everything. So, let's read this again. Then these men were bound in their coats, their hosen, their hats, their other garments, in other words, their inner and their outer garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. So, the king has them bound. He takes them up. These 3 men carry him up, and the king observes these 3 men falling into the fiery furnace. Now, remember, this type of furnace was not completely boxed or sealed in with 4 sides. It would have had an opening, remember, for men to go in there and work, like steel works, brick works, whatever. It was big enough to where you could see inside this fiery furnace. That's important, okay, that you could see in it. Now, let's move on. Therefore, because the king's command was urgent, and the furnace was heated exceedingly hot, the flame of the fire slew those men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, I want you to think about that a minute. This flame was so hot, it was so intense, the heat was, that the 3 individuals that carried him up and throwed him in this fiery furnace fell over dead. Now, as they fell over dead, let's go on, verse 23. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Now remember, they were bound. They could not move. This is so important, okay? Let's go over it again. The king had the furnace heated up 7 times hotter than normal. All right. Now, the 3 that carried him up fell over dead, remember. They were bound in all their clothes. This is very important. Now, let's move on. The king, now let's look at this. Verse 24 and 25. I'm going to read them. Let's talk about them, okay? Starting to get good here now. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonished. In other words, something has amazed this king, okay? And he rose up in haste and spake and said unto his counselors. Remember, he would have wanted a spectacle of this. They would have been all the important people in the provinces of Babylon would have tended this. He would have called them in. Why would he have done that? One main reason. He's going to show how these 3 men's rebellion, this is what he thinks is going to happen. Their deaths would scare the other people, and if anybody else tried to rebel against him, this would would stop it. That's what the king, he called, you could imagine a big spectacle here. Now, the king is getting ready to see something that amazed him. In other words, things are not going the way he figured they would go, or any of us. All right. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonished, and rose up in haste, and spake, and said unto his counselors. He says, in other words, he's standing here looking, he says, did we not cast 3 men bound, in other words, bound with a rope, into the midst of the fire? Now remember, these men were bound. They couldn't move. They couldn't have moved out of that fire. It would have been impossible. In other words, king says, didn't we not cast 3 men in? They're standing there watching him right now. They're standing there observing this going on right now, okay? They answered and said, yeah, true, king. We did. Yeah, you threw 3 men in. All right. Verse 26. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the mouth of the burning fire furnace. He's seen something that's amazed him so much. He walked to the entrance of this fire. He wanted to get a better look to make sure he was not seeing something that had fooled him, that he thought was any type of a technique that would fool him. So he steps up and he gets a good vision of it. All right. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near the mouth of the burning fire furnace and spake and said, he calls for these 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He says, you servants of the Most High God, he says, come forth and come hither. Now, I left out a verse. Let me back up. All right, I'm sorry. Did we not cast 3 men bound in the midst of the fire? And they said, yes, king, you did. All right. Well, the king answered here in verse 25, and he said, wait a minute. He says, lo, I see 4 men loose. Remember that. Remember that word loose. Walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt. This is very important. And the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. How do you know that God had a son named Jesus? We're going to get to that. He sees 4 men loose. Now, listen to this. Walking in the midst of the fire. They weren't trying to run out of the fire, guys. They were walking in the middle of the fire. They wasn't trying to run out of the fire. Because he says they have no hurt. In other words, they're not trying to escape and run out of the fire. What happened to the ropes? We're going to get to that. He says, in the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. How does he even know? How does he know God has a son named Jesus? Think about that a minute. Jesus says, I have a name written on me that no man knows but me. But they would have recognized him because he is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And this king would have recognized him. He stood out. His power, his beauty, his whatever, his light, whatever. Something stood out for this king, for him to realize that this was, in fact, part of the Trinity or the Godhead. Okay, now, think about this. This amazed him. These 4 men walking in the midst of the fire. They're not trying to run out of the fire. So the fire, he says himself right here, they have no hurt. I mean, they're standing in the fire. They're walking around in the fire. You know, this is what he's saying. All right. Now let's go on, and I'll back to 26. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near the mouth of the burning fire furnace. Just like I said, he wanted to make sure he was seeing what his eyes were showing him. He says, and spake and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He said, servants of the Most High God. In other words, he's in there with you. He says, come forth and come hither. In other words, come out. Come out of the flame. You're untied, come out. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came forth from the midst of the fire. Now, guys, it gets better. The king was so astonished and amazed at what he's saying that he had to go down to He had to go down to the entrance to the fire and ask the guys to come out of the fire. He asked them. He said, come out. Come out of the fire. Remember, they were bound before and they could not move. It's very important. Let's look at verse 27. And the priests, the princes, the governors, the captains, and the king's counselors, being gathered together, saw these men upon whose bodies the fire had no power. In other words, the fire didn't touch them. Now listen to this. Nor was a hair of their head singed, neither were their coats changed, nor the smell of the fire had passed on them. Guys, it's amazing. You build a campfire outside and that smoke hits you one time, you're going to smell it on your clothes. These guys were thrown in the midst of a burning fiery furnace that was heated 7 times hotter. And our God's such a miraculous God that He not only saves them from the fire, but He goes in the fire with them. Now, before I go on, there's a lesson in that by itself, okay? God is in that trial with you. If you're going through a trial and tribulation, God's with you. He's not left you. If you belong to Him, if you are born again and you belong and you're His child, He will never leave you, nor will He ever forsake you. He's with you. Trust in Him. Things will get better. Sometimes we're put to a test for one reason. It's to grow us. It's for us. Any trial that God puts us through is for us. We benefit from that trial or tribulation, guys, because if we ask and we draw nearer to Him and draw closer to Him, that's what He wants from us. It makes our relationship more or stronger, I'll say. Now, let's move on. Nor was a hair of their head singed, neither their coats changed, nor the smell of fire had passed on them. You know, God pointed something out to me, though, the other day. He did burn one thing off of these individuals. He burnt the ropes off of them. Think about that a minute. As many times as I studied this, as many times as I've read through this, I never thought about that. God removed their ropes. Think about that a minute. If first thing went through my mind, if God had removed my ropes, I would have run out of that fire. These men didn't. Because God was in the fire with them. It's a lesson that we need to really think about in our daily walk with Him. God will burn the ropes off of you when you're in a trial or tribulation. But don't run from Him. Run to Him. And that's what these individuals did. Because the king had to call these 3 men to come out of the fire. Because they was not coming out. Because their God that they served was in the trial with them. A good lesson for us to learn from it. Verse 28. Then Nebuchadnezzar spoke and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who had sent His angel to deliver His servants that trusted Him, and have changed the king's word, and yielded their bodies, that they might not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Sad the king doesn't get this lesson till later, though. But let me go ahead and we'll close out tonight with 29 and 30. So Nebuchadnezzar makes another decree. Therefore, I make a decree, he says. Remember, when he makes a decree, it's written into law by the wise men. If he speaks it, then it comes true. It's automatic law, in other words. That every people, nation, and language which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut into pieces. Here it is. Remember the judgment. He'll cut them into pieces, and their house shall be made a dunghill, because there is no other God that can deliver after this sort. Now, remember, he didn't fully accept their God. He made a decree that anybody that speaks against these three, in other words, what the king's saying here, is when my image, when all the instruments start playing, and everybody else has to bow down to this image, but, is what he's saying, you do not speak against Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, because, in other words, Daniel, Hananiah, and Azariah is their Hebrew name, because they serve their Hebrew God, and he was able to deliver them from this. That's exactly what the king's saying. So then, verse 30, then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So, guys, that actually concludes our lesson tonight on chapter 3. Next Tuesday night, we'll pick up. The king is going to have another dream, and we're actually going to get into another dream with the king. Everyone, please like and share so God's word gets out. And please invite someone to join in with us. I would love to see this ministry continue to grow and grow. I thank everybody for actually logging on and listening to me teach God's word. And again, everyone have a blessed and wonderful Tuesday night. And everyone have a wonderful night. Good night.